Let the past die. Kill it, if you have to. That's the only way to become what you were meant to be.
I feel like Star Wars, Lucasfilm, and everyone in general at Disney have taken this quote way too far. From what I have observed over the last near decade since Star Wars was reinvigorated in The Force Awakens, and that's putting it loosely, was that there was a consistent disdain for anything traditional. All throughout the sequel trilogy, there were countless references to the past and why it never seemed to be a good thing. Old heroes that we remember had suddenly lost any ability that they had had, usually because they were old and male oftentimes. They forgot how to speak, they forgot what they had learned, they forgot the morals and values they used to hold, the character arcs they had gone through, and just pretty much everything that had made them who they were was left in the past and forgotten about. We the fans didn't forget, but let's not forget how much Kathleen Kennedy, Bob Iger, and Lucasfilm in general put into the opinions of the fans. Simultaneously saying that Star Wars is for everyone and then turning around and rejecting the fan base that made them such a success doesn't really strike as a very good business practice. But then, we have also learned lately from the corporate world,
you have to force behaviors. And if you don't force behaviors, whether it's gender or race or just any way you want to say the composition of your team, you're going to be impacted.
Well, we're going on about 9 years of attempted force feeding right now, and I think several years back is when the fans decided that they had all had enough. And with every new project that is announced, every new director that opens their mouth in an interview, every new story that just has to be told for the purposes of updating Star Wars for modern audiences, we get closer and closer to the end of the funeral that has been dropping dirt onto the casket that holds George Lucas's original work. How did we get here? How did we get to a point where Star Wars is either despised or ignored by the fans who are just begging for it to stop because we have had enough? I think in large part, it's a genuine case of jealousy for the fact that this medium exists and has had the level of success it has, and a hatred for any sort of values that don't mirror the modern activists that have invaded Disney's ranks. There's a lot of ignorance, too, a lack of understanding on how to tell a proper story, and a great deal of self-aggrandizing fantasies that have taken place. From the insertions of the perfect female character to the power fantasies that have been told a dime a dozen times, we have seen it all and heard it all from Hollywood writers who are writing for themselves and themselves only. And now, with The Acolyte only a month away from its release date on Disney+, which is going to just be a doozy of a show, all things considered, I have come to the realization that it might be time to read the Star Wars eulogy. The invitations have been sent, the arrangements made, the mourners have gathered into their seats and are waiting for the opening remarks to be given. So let me oblige and offer my opinions on why Star Wars has died, and we are now hearing the very long funerary dirge. I could talk for hours about everything I've just mentioned. The strong female characters, the abrasive disregard for legacy heroes, the never-ending conversations about power and revenge that make me want to hurl, or even the way Star Wars looks no different than any other fantasy show that's cursed our television screens in the last few years. It feels cheap now. It feels small. It feels hollow. But here are some of the more subtle reasons why. One of the first indicators that we had of the impending demise of Star Wars is repetition. I have heard the phrase, imitation is the best form of flattery, but in this case, in the entertainment industry, it only insinuates a lack of risk-taking, and more importantly, creativity. The most prime example of this is the sequel trilogy itself, which tries desperately to be a newer and better version of the original trilogy, but fails utterly on every level. We have Rey, who is clearly the new Luke, living on a desert backwater planet while she dreams of flying and adventure, a life beyond the monotonous one that she has managed to carve out. Unlike Luke, however, she has no familial bonds, so she can't be held back by family or driven and motivated like other human beings are. Relationships are just so monotonous, aren't they? Then, of course, the place she calls home is attacked by the Empire. The First Order, in search of a missing asset that has important plans. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. She and the asset escape and run into a smuggler who assists them on their journey, which leads to them encountering the Jedi, the Resistance, and ending with the death of a treasured mentor that fuels the young hero into coming into their own power. But instead of using the skills they have learned and depending on others for help like Luke did, this is where Rey differs fundamentally. She requires no training, you see. She requires no mentor, but takes one because it's apparently the thing to do in the Star Wars universe and proceeds to learn Jack from him. But unlike Obi-Wan giving himself up so Luke can escape the Death Star with Leia and Han, that same old mentor is then killed by his own son in an attempt to cement his position into the ranks of the dark side, and thus ending a lot of goodwill that the fans had. Let me be clear, I am not against heroes dying, but doing so in a pointless or ignoble manner is a complete betrayal, character-wise. And then the story ends, with the main character jetting off to an unknown planet for training in the same manner that Luke did decades ago. And you see where I'm going. For as much as Disney Lucasfilm seem to despise the past and their legacy characters and are intent on humiliating them in the most egregious ways possible, they also are so creatively bankrupt that they have no idea how to write a story on their own, and in doing so have robbed themselves and the fans of any success that they might have had. Rey is a poor imitation of Luke, while Poe is a poor imitation of Han, and Finn strangely seems to fit the profile of Leia. Kudos to John Boyega for putting up with all of that and then letting it all loose later. Not that the shadowy execs ever seem to learn their lesson. Repetition seems to be the only way that Disney Star Wars knows how to function. But at the same time, they are so obsessed with hating on the past and churning out their own quote-unquote better versions of what came before that they have turned into parodies of themselves. They want Rey to be a better version of Luke Skywalker, and so they ensure that she has all the faith in the world and all the skill, while simultaneously needing no training or experience to make her as good as she suddenly is. The explanation that she is somehow a Palpatine clone could have been an interesting one if they humanized her enough to make it mean something. As it is, we are left with an utterly strange dichotomy of hating on the past and desperately trying to imitate it at the same time. An old Luke Skywalker being a poor imitation of Yoda certainly didn't endear the fans to the writers at all. And then him giving up on every moral he ever held, especially the unshakable faith that he had certainly, made The Last Jedi the most polarizing film that the fan base has ever watched, and dividing the fans on a massive level. In an attempt to draw in more fans, the sequel trilogy tried desperately to cover up for the fact that they were merely repeating the work of better artists that have come before them and doing it very, very poorly. As a result of that, and many other things, the sequel trilogy ruined any goodwill that most of the fans had towards them long before a lot of other Star Wars media was released. And that's an apt place to state my second reason for the ways in which Star Wars has died: duplication. This is not to be confused with repetition, in that it has more to do with characters, more so than a desperate attempt to create something new and failing miserably at it. Star Wars, in an attempt to appeal to the female audience, that for the most part didn't care as much about Star Wars as the male audience did, decided that they were going to insert female characters alongside male characters as often as possible. Whether it was Fennec Shand alongside Boba Fett, Bo-Katan alongside Mando, Reva/Leia alongside Obi-Wan Kenobi, Rey alongside Luke Skywalker, it didn't matter. Every male character who ever had some role to play in classic Star Wars suddenly had a female companion to aid him in whatever mission he was facing. For the most part, those male characters were made to look on some level of incompetence, and as a result, the shows were clogged with a great deal of unnecessary characters that did not endear themselves to the audiences, and that no one really cared about because they were force-fed to us. The Book of Boba Fett did not need Fennec Shand. Mando did not need Bo-Katan in Season 3. Obi-Wan did not need Reva or Leia, and on and on. Not only does this do a disservice to the male characters, but it certainly is an insult to the female characters as well, because it insinuates that they cannot be characters of their own merit, that they must tag along on the coattails of the characters that have come before them, and in a sense, be lesser. Because their sole purpose is either to distract from the main male character, or else be some sort of mirror to show how incompetent or fragile or out of touch or hopeless he is, and to offer a better glimpse of what the writers think the audience wants by comparison. It is probably the most bizarre and aggravating form of storytelling that I can think of, and it happens constantly. The only time we are given some form of reprieve from this sarlacc pit of creativity is when the main character of a show is a female, and even then the shows still aren't that great. And maybe one of the most frustrating things that Star Wars has done to kill itself comes in the form of division. When I say division, I mean that the stories are quite literally split in favor of characters whom the shows are supposed to be about, and the characters that have been made up to send a message or to fulfill a quota or insert modernity into the script. These are, in a sense, lesser characters with lesser storylines, lesser motivations, and lesser depth than any of the mains. In a show like Obi-Wan Kenobi, a legacy character played by an actor that was one of the unquestionably good things about the prequel trilogy, suddenly the story has become all about the strong, diverse female character who is given the privilege of having her story told when the focus should be on the main character for whom the show is named. Likewise, with The Mandalorian, the writers have done a similar disservice to Din Djarin by making their third season, the season that many of us were waiting for as one of the last decent things about Star Wars, all about Bo-Katan. The third season of The Mandalorian was focused on Bo working alongside and then eventually taking over for Din in every way. When stories are divided in such a way with characters that are lesser in every way, when it comes to morals, when it comes to plot, when it comes to motivations and depth, well, then it takes away from the narrative potency a story can have. And when it happens often enough, people tend to drift away because the stories don't mean anything anymore, and they become fractured. Star Wars has also turned on its own morals to an alarming degree. George Lucas himself had clear ideals and morals for his characters when he was writing these stories, and the one thing that Star Wars seemed to embody more than anything else was a message of hope, a belief in the decency of man, of courage, and of redemption. And yet now, a nihilism has infested the franchise, from legacy characters being turned into failures for reasons that make very little sense, to the villains' desperate attempts to be seen as grey, or even as moral human beings despite all the awful things that they have done. The characters from the old stories had a courage about them, and a constancy that did not allow them to give up no matter what, and yet I can think now of multiple examples of legacy characters turning their backs on morals that they used to hold fiercely. It's disheartening and infuriating, and it's being done to demoralize the audience as well. It's being done to send a message that these values are old-fashioned and aren't worth anything anymore. And in their place is a sterile, colorless world where new and lesser characters are scrambling to put together some semblance of a story and are failing miserably. Right and wrong have been replaced with lines like this.
This isn't about good or bad. This is about power and who is allowed to use it.
And when we reach an age of storytelling where there is no right, there is no wrong, where nothing exists save power and people's constant quest for it, not only does this render the story unreliable, but it completely nullifies the writer's credibility. As human beings, we like to hear stories of good versus evil. For all of human history, those have been some of the best stories to be told. The hero's journey is not old-fashioned, it is not out of date, nor is it outmoded. Instead, it's a story that modern audiences still want, despite all of the attempts of Hollywood to train us to think otherwise. And this, ultimately, is why Star Wars is dead, and will remain so until the hero's journey is once more regarded with respect. The message does not matter. The diversity does not matter. All that matters to audiences is the story. And until we remember this, storytelling will forever and always be terrible. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. What do you think about the modern iterations of Star Wars that we have seen so far? Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments section, and let the conversations begin. Until next time, everyone.